Okay, I think maybe we will get going, get started. More people may well be joining us, but it's already 4:03, and so I think we do want to get going on time. We have a lot to cover in the next hour. My name is Eric Miller. I'm a professor in the Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering at the University of Toronto, and I'm Director of Mobility Network. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today for the UTM Mobility Network Student Research Showcase. Maybe before we go any further into the details of why we're here and what we're going to do, I would like to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates for thousands of years. It has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Indeed, we're all grateful to be here together and to be gathered together to hear about some very interesting student-based research. So Mobility Network is a little over a year old, although it's been a couple of years in the making. Our mandate is literally to try to establish and build and grow a network of mobility researchers across the three campuses, across the entirety of the University of Toronto. UOT is blessed with tremendous breadth and depth in just about every field you could possibly think of, but certainly in the area of mobility and transportation. What we want to do is promote, help weave together researchers from across the three campuses, promote research, develop research activities, and then take that research out through knowledge translation, mobilization activities out into the real world and have impact. And we want to be doing that in establishing this network. We want to be promoting research. We want to be promoting training and mentorship. We want to be promoting dialogue and interconnections, both within the university and with people outside the university as well. And so I think this student research competition that has been run is a great example of exactly the sorts of things we want to be doing. I think it touches both the research mission we have of encouraging research, but also training and mentorship in terms of helping to train our students and give them experience in mobility-related research. I think is also extremely important in that in building this network, we particularly are interested in building the networks within the University of Toronto Mississauga as well as UT Scarborough, both within the Mississauga community, but also connecting UTM with the rest of the university. So again, I think this activity is a great example of getting people engaged within UTM and getting excited about mobility research. So the objective today is to present have our student researchers present their work, and so I think with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over and introduce our associate director for UTM at Mobility Network, Professor Shauna Brail. She's the associate director for UTM and Mobility Network. She's an associate professor at the Institute for Management and Innovation at UTM, and she's also a senior associate in the Innovation Policy Lab, Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. She's an economic geographer and urban planner. Her research focuses on transformation of cities as a result of economic, social, and cultural change. She has a much longer CV, but I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to turn her over. She's extremely valuable partner in our network, bringing perspectives from economic geography to new mobility systems and how mobility is transforming in a variety of ways. And she was very much the author and instigator of this student research competition. So it's my great pleasure to turn it over to Shauna that will then proceed to introduce our researchers. So over to you, Shauna.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. And thank you to the support of the broader Mobility Network as the UTM Mobility Network launches their very first UTM specific event as part of the funding for the Mobility Network, UTM faculty are very fortunate to have some funding that is dedicated to supporting their research and student research to help connect us better with the broader goals of the Mobility Network. And so last fall, we held our first student research competition, and today you will hear from 5 graduate students who are supervised by UTM faculty. And what I think is one of the most impactful pieces of the sort of the joining of this group of 5 is that the research is all very different and very unique, and really helps us to understand all of the different components that go into understanding mobility and the impacts of mobility on society. And so I'd like to introduce our very first speaker, Haifa AlArasi, who is a planning PhD candidate focusing on digital ethnographic explorations in reproductions of childhoods and cities. And under the Mobility Network, AlArasi will focus on examining fleeting visual narratives of travel produced by newcomer immigrant adolescents that fall under acts of appropriations of claiming the suburban as a legitimate site of childhood. AlArasi is supervised in this research by Professor Ron Buehling. And Haifa, if you're ready, then I think you can take over and begin to share your slides. Thank you.
Thanks, Shauna. Okay, let me just go into full screen mode. So, good afternoon, everyone. As Shauna said, my name is Haifa AlArasi, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Geography and Planning. I would like first to thank Dr. Shauna Brail and Dr. Eric Miller, as well as the committee at the Mobility Network for seeing the merit of my research. And I'm very honored to be part of the inaugural Graduate Research Fund and to be here and give a brief snippet of my research, which is titled Grounded Mappings of Immigrant Adolescents Non-School Mobility in Mississauga. And so the research fills a gap in childhood transportation studies that have primarily given much attention to younger urban childhoods and their active school travel, with less focus on the mobility experiences of other understudied groups. So in the sense, the study looks at a specific cohort of bodies, namely racialized adolescents, and more specifically, those who have recently arrived to Canada. It takes place in Mississauga, which is home to more than 50% foreign-born residents. And it looks at trips outside the homeschool binary, given adolescents' increasing participation in extracurricular activities. The exploration also looks at mobility beyond the corporeal into a practice that is deeply embedded in macro and micro processes, and also embodied as it relates to the mobile subject's identity and milieu. So to do that, we worked with 4 community centers to co-create a research strategy that engages a total of 28 participants by employing a digital ethnographic methodology that included a few methods, including participatory mapping, one-on-one interviews, and visual and creative methods that include recordings of photos and videos, as well as collective editings of videos. And so there was almost more than 300 photos and videos that were collected. And looking at this collective data, we get an understanding of nuanced immobilities that are intertwined with temporal, socioeconomic, and institutional processes of risk, suburban automobility, cultural and religious ordering, and consumer society, including here, for example, I'm just going to highlight a few, how, for example, the sociocultural order of risk manifested as a gendered experience of racism and sexism and intersectional violence in public transit. We also, through triangulation of the data sources, created what we call grounded mobility narratives for a few of our participants. Of course, we know that these are not meant to be generalized findings, but we intentionally approach them with an intersectional sensibility to highlight differentially mobile subjects and examine more critically racialized bodies on the move. Again, for the lack of time, I'll just highlight through a couple of these narratives. For example, although the previous slides pointed to a gendered experience when it comes to perception of risk and stranger danger, We also see how it manifested for Ahmed, one of our participants, when coupled with his positioning as a racialized newcomer. For him, a lack of familiarity resulted in a narrow travel range, especially without access to car rides. But we also see how his mobility is extended virtually via video gaming and watching of soccer games, and sometimes how this extended his corporeal mobility as seen in point 4, for example. We also see how care work shaped his activities, the everyday and mobility decisions and outcomes as seen in points 3 and 6, where he takes care of his younger siblings and also navigates health systems with his parents. For participants like Basil, for example, some participants navigated their own or their parents' perception of risk by utilizing their familiarity with specific routes or the bus driver or by the company of their friends and or their siblings. We also look here at uncover through these grounded narratives specific exploration of how mobile time is used and how mobile spaces are reproduced, whether as a productive space or spaces of familiar conversation or consumption as seen in points 4 and point 6. I'm just going to go through the videos. It also opened an exploration of liminal places of childhood that we categorize under 4 main types, including physical places, mobile places, digital places, and representational places. And the embodied negotiation of access and tactical, what we label as tactical mobilities that some participants employed to unlock inaccessible modes or inaccessible places, including, for example, photoshopping a freedom pass by older participants to get free trip rides on the My Way transit, even though they're not allowed to get the freedom pass. I'm not going to delve much into this, but via one of our methods, specifically here, the collective video editing done by participants in one community center, we reveal another negotiation tactic in the representational place of film, with our participants intentionally reproducing the innocence held of them in our psyche as adults, while censoring some experiences from the adults, except for the insider status that I gained as a researcher, leading us to position them as, frame them as subjects with double consciousness with their mobility practices, potentially being political practices, creating momentarily raptures that dissipates as soon as they happen. So in terms of policy implications, there are context-specific policies that includes to improve accessibility and safety, including reduced group fare, design improvement for shelters and buses, free Wi-Fi, for wayfinding, and allowing for activity stacking while on the move. But there are also research policies given the very ambitious vision statement for the transportation master plan and the strategic plan for the city of Mississauga of a continued exploration of mobilities for underrepresented children and adolescents, including non-active modes and in-between spaces to further our understanding of different practices and to lay continuous connections to understand different exclusions and accessibility of travel modes. Ongoing research questions include this idea of research and mapping as an arrangement and this critical examination and engagement in reflexive thinking of different sites of knowledge and dissemination and what that means when we share the knowledge, and also the possible unlearning from the embodied experiences of our participants to lean more into sociotemporal rhythms that not necessarily depend on flexibility and speed, but maybe into joy, care, kinship, and other mobility possibilities. And with that, I think I'm on time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion later on. Thanks.
Haifa, thank you. We can all clap for you on our reactions. And I should have said at the outset that we're going to hold questions until the end when we'll have a moderated discussion. But thank you very much for that presentation and for helping us to see new ways of looking at the people's experience on transit for highlighting, and I know I asked you to do this, but for highlighting the policy implications and opportunities for policy responses once we understand what these experiences are, and also for thinking about mobilities as joy and kinship. So thank you very much. Our next presenter is going to be Emily Power. Emily, you can start to load up your slides if you want. While I introduce you, Emily is a student in the Master of Science in Planning program in the Department of Geography and Planning, and her research interests include planning and social justice, gentrification, financialization of housing, and tenant struggles. For the Mobility Network, her project analyzes transit-induced gentrification and displacement resulting from light rail transit planning in Hamilton, with a focus on the working-class Afro-Caribbean neighborhoods along the route. And Emily is supervised by Professor Alan Wachs. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, Dr. Brail. As you mentioned, yes, I'm a student in the Masters of Planning program in the Department of Geography and Planning. I'd like to thank the Mobility Network for funding this research and my supervisor, Dr. Wachs, for his support throughout. My project is titled Demanding Justice in Transit Planning, a case study of light rail transit gentrification in Hamilton, Ontario. I come to this research as a resident of Hamilton myself and a tenant living 1 block south of the proposed LRT route. Also someone who's been involved as a tenant organizer with a grassroots tenant group called King Street Tenants United, which is a group of tenants living in apartment buildings purchased by Metrolinx, trying to fight back against displacement and demolition of their homes, and for fair compensation. And my main research questions for this project are, how have transit plans by Metrolinx and the City of Hamilton planners encouraged gentrification? How could this be mitigated in other cities where Metrolinx has projects planned? And how can working class neighborhoods organize to demand public transit and affordable housing? The light rail transit project in Hamilton was announced first in 2015. It's a 17-stop, 14-kilometer project that runs the length of the city from McMaster University in the West End through the downtown and to Eastgate Square in the east end of the city. And this project was canceled in 2019 when the Ford government came into power, but later revived through a joint funding agreement by the provincial and federal governments for $3.5 billion. Construction is expected to start in 2024 and anticipated the train will be operational 5 years later. The City of Hamilton planners have upzoned land in the LRT corridor. This includes a new downtown Hamilton secondary plan permitting 30-story buildings as of right, a new Centennial neighborhood secondary plan, which is shown here on the east portion of the map, at the eastern terminus of the LRT, permitting 20-story buildings as of right. And then throughout the LRT corridor in the dashed line, you can see the transit-oriented corridor zones, which permit 10-story buildings as of right. Metrolinx plans to purchase and demolish 90 properties in order to widen the road for track and station construction. Most demolitions are planned for the Gibson and Lansdale neighborhoods. And this is a Afro-Caribbean and Filipino district with many low-income renter families. Metrolinx began its eviction program in 2018, and early reports from tenants confirmed people were given differential treatment and very little in the way of compensation. For example, one tenant received a mere $200 towards moving expenses. And when knocking on doors, we heard many stories of tenants being pushed out by their original landlords before Metrolinx took over. In these cases, tenants received no rehousing support. But after a pressure campaign by King Street Tenants United, Metrolinx increased its standard offer to include assistance finding an apartment, first and last month's rent, moving costs, utility reconnection costs, and a rental subsidy for 1 year. However, this fell short of what tenants demanded. As many people pointed out, what were people to do when that 12-month subsidy ran out? And it's very likely many of these people evicted in 2018 are on the brink of homelessness today. We conducted a survey of displacement to count the number of residents and businesses facing displacement by Metrolinx. And we walked the route, knocking on doors, talking with residents and business owners, counting mailboxes and water meters. In total, we estimate 168 apartment units, 12 single-family homes, and 72 businesses are being displaced by Metrolinx. In my interviews with Metrolinx tenants, people expressed their shock and anger at the behavior of Metrolinx and City of Hamilton planners and politicians when it comes to this project. Jody says, the LRT has been an ongoing controversial subject for 15 years. Not one single city council or mayor had a housing plan in place. They knew we would be displaced. They've known all along and they didn't care. Natalia says, I don't think that any project is worth uprooting so many different people in so many different communities, especially if there's no plan as to where those people are going to go and who is going to live there after these projects are done too. Finally, Caleb says, the willingness to put so many people at risk, to hurt so many people for the sake of a transit project, that doesn't sound like anything I want my city to be about. This is not the kind of city I want to be part of. It's clear that the LRT project has acted as a major impetus for gentrification in Hamilton. Since the LRT was announced in 2015, there have been more than 50 developments proposed along the corridor, many by large condominium developers. Of the 15,000 residential units proposed, the majority are condominiums and only 150 are affordable rental or ownership units. Similarly, there have been many apartment building acquisitions by investor landlords. 75 apartment buildings along the corridor have changed hands, more than 2,000 apartment units, and many of these have been sold by small landlords to investor firms. For example, Mallium, Pulis, Forge and Foster, Executive Properties, and Interrent REIT. And tenants report aggressive strategies used by landlords trying to push them out in order to renovate and raise rents on turnover. There are LRT projects under construction or in the planning stages in several other cities. And I would argue that Metrolinx and municipal planning departments need to adopt a new set of best practices to learn from the mistakes in the Hamilton case and mitigate the effects of transit-induced gentrification in these other places. Number one, they need to fund transit and fund housing in equal measure. Funding from the provincial and federal governments should be matched with funding for social housing. Second, they need to support tenants in a meaningful way. Any tenant whose apartment building will be demolished should be properly compensated and experience minimal disruption to their lives. Thirdly, leftover land acquired for the transit project should be donated to public agencies and nonprofits rather than sold to the highest bidder. I estimate of the 90 properties Metrolinx will purchase for the Hamilton project, there are 16 acres in total that are being acquired. And under current zoning permissions, this could allow for 3,500 units to be built. Given the scale of transit-induced gentrification from this project, I would argue that all of those should become social housing rather than condominiums. Finally, we should make demands of developers. The province's inclusionary zoning framework allows municipalities to introduce requirements for developers building within 800 meters of a transit station to dedicate a proportion of units for affordable housing. And each city can set the terms of the IZ policy in terms of what percentage of units must be set aside and the level of affordability. So even though Hamilton has had the power to do this since 2016, planners did not introduce a draft policy until just a couple months ago. And tenant advocates in Hamilton have called for a 25% set-aside rate along the LRT route. If such a policy had been in place a few years ago, we could have produced 3,800 units of affordable housing already. So in summary, I would argue that Metrolinx and City of Hamilton planners have done a very poor job considering tenants and working class people in the planning of these transit projects. And as a result, this is seen by many not as a public transit project, but a impetus for gentrification. And in future, public interest planners need to do more to act with integrity and prioritize both high quality public transit and affordable housing for all. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Emily, for sharing your research with us. I think it sort of what you do so well is help to create a new, shine a light on the fact that although we want to promote transit-oriented development, that it has the potential for lots of benefit, including increasing density and creating stronger connections between land use planning and transportation planning, that there are questions we continue to need to ask about who wins and who loses out and who is most impacted. And I think you've done that really, really clearly in this work. And it's only probably become more relevant in the last year than when you first proposed it because of the growing housing affordability crisis across Canada's cities. So thank you very much for that. Our next presenter is Sophie Roussy. And Sophie, you can feel free to load up your slides as I introduce you if you like. Sophie is a student at the Master of Science in Physical Geography, Environment and Health Collaborative Specialization. And Roussy's research focuses on the intersection of transportation-related air pollution, which is shortened to TRAP, marginalization, human exposure, including its equitable distribution, and health outcomes. And Sophie is supervised by Professor Matt Adams, and she is going to present her investigation of environmental inequality across Etobicoke-York, Toronto. Thank you, Sophie.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Before we get started, I would just like to thank the UTM Mobility Network for supporting my research and inviting me here today. So, as we said, my name is Sophie Roussy, and today I'll be presenting on my research submitted to the Mobility Network titled Spatial Associations Between Marginalization, TRAP, and Health Outcomes, an investigation, of environmental inequality across Etobicoke-York, Toronto, Canada. And just to preface, my research did change slightly from what I initially submitted, so bear with me if you notice any changes between what was posted on the website and what I'm presenting on today. So for a bit of context and into my research objectives. So transportation systems are integral to urban life, and as we know, play a large role in fostering resilient, sustainable, and just urban growth. Now, for a city to be sustainable and resilient, the externalities, TRAP, or transportation-related air pollution, must be equitably distributed. Unfortunately, this is often not the case. In Canada, approximately 1/3 of residents live near major roadways or highways, causing an elevated risk of exposure to TRAP. And as many of us know, exposure to TRAP is associated with a multitude of adverse health outcomes that together contribute to elevated rates of mortality among Canadians. Now, the health risks associated with TRAP are not borne equally. racialized communities and those affected by socioeconomic marginalization are not only disproportionately susceptible to poor health, but also tend to experience disproportionately high TRAP concentrations, which together contribute to elevated rates, which together result in environmentally driven health disparities. Now, in order to make meaningful inferences about the nature and distribution of TRAP health risks for a given area, accurate exposure estimates are required, and with that, a spatially refined understanding of the distribution of TRAP. Now, in the city of Toronto, the current air pollution information provided at the government level is based on just 4 regulatory monitors, and therefore can only provide residents with a limited amount of information on the air pollution exposure and health risks for their city without properly reflecting the spatial complexity of air pollution. As well, in the context of urban growth, this type of information becomes even more important as many cities continue to experience changes and expansions in their transportation infrastructure to accommodate this outward growth. So with this in mind, my research objectives were twofold. First, I characterized the spatial distribution of ambient nitrogen dioxide, or NO2, as a proxy for TRAP across Etobicoke-York, which is just the westernmost subsection of the city of Toronto. And then I examined disparities in NO2 exposure and associated health outcomes among groups of differing levels of marginalization across Etobicoke-York. So just a quick overview of my research methodology. So we began by conducting high spatial density urban sampling of NO2 using Ogawa passive diffusion air pollution samplers at 181 sampling locations across Etobicoke-York. In Etobicoke-York, the Etobicoke-York boundary has a surface area of 101 kilometers squared, so we achieved a sampling density of about 1 sampler per square kilometer. We then developed the land use regression model, or an LUR model, with regression kringing to translate those point estimates of NO2 into a predictive spatial surface across Etobicoke-York. And what land use regression models do is they relate observed air pollution concentrations and variability to local land use and environmental conditions to then estimate pollution concentrations at unobserved locations. From here, we use that generated predictive spatial surface for NO2 to then estimate exposure concentrations at the dissemination area level, or the DA level. And this is the smallest geographic unit at which census data are disseminated in Canada. We then used the Ontario Marginalization Index, or the 2016 ON-MARG, to calculate varying levels of marginalization across Etobicoke-York, at the dissemination area level. And this is just a multifaceted area-based index that incorporates demographic data from the 2016 Canadian Census into 4 area-level dimensions of marginalization across Ontario. And these include residential instability, material deprivation, dependency, and ethnic concentration. And we rescaled these metrics to our study area. Finally, we used a combination of ordinary least squares and simultaneous autoregressive, or OLS and SAR modeling techniques to then examine associations between those NO2 exposure levels and the level of marginalization for dissemination areas across Etobicoke-York. We also used a logistic regression approach to then generate odd ratios with 95% confidence intervals to then examine whether the odds of dissemination areas having high or low exposure levels, and this was determined as either above or below the median NO2 exposure level for Etobicoke-York, was associated with high levels of marginalization. And in an upcoming analysis, we are going to calculate excess all-cause mortality for each dissemination area based on their estimated NO2 exposure levels to then examine potential environmentally driven health disparities. So now on to the results. We'll start with figure 1, which is the resulting NO2 exposure surface for Etobicoke-York. As we can see, there are exposure hotspots adjacent to the Toronto Pearson International Airport and in southern Etobicoke-York, which is also near the downtown core. Exposure levels were generally lowest in residential areas, which is also where we see the greatest proportion of parks and urban vegetation in Etobicoke-York. So now moving on to table 1, and this just provides an overview of our OLS, SAR, and odds ratios. So across each of our OLS and SAR models, residential instability, material deprivation, and ethnic concentration showed a significant positive association with NO2 exposure. with ethnic concentration showing the strongest association. On the other hand, dependency consistently showed a significant negative association with NO2 exposure, suggesting a potential protective effect here. Now, in our logistic regression analysis, high levels of ethnic concentration were associated with the greatest odds of high NO2 exposure levels, followed by material deprivation and residential instability. Specifically, the odds of having high NO2 exposure levels or NO2 exposure levels above the median were almost 4 times higher for dissemination areas with high levels of ethnic concentration as compared to low levels. And once again, dependency showed a negative association with NO2 exposure, in which the odds of having high NO2 exposure levels were 57% lower for dissemination areas with high as compared to low levels of dependency. So now to end with significance. So my research developed exposure risk estimates for NO2 for the entirety of Etobicoke-York at a much finer scale than what is provided at the government level. This data can be used to inform individuals of concentration levels closer to their actual geospatial location and can guide them in making decisions about their daily activities that reduce their exposure and potential for associated health risks. This data can also help to inform and keep policy on public health, municipal planning, and transportation control relevant in Etobicoke-York, which becomes increasingly important as transportation infrastructure continues to change and expand to accommodate for urban sprawl. My research also highlighted high-risk demographics for TRAP exposure and associated health risks, and these can act as relevant covariates for adjusting models of TRAP exposure and health, which can allow for more accurate exposure and health risk estimates to be generated, and again lend support to the development of more equitable public health, municipal planning, and emission control policy for high-risk populations. And finally, my research provides an interdisciplinary framework for addressing urban sprawl in the city of Toronto that necessarily acknowledges equity and promotes resilient, sustainable, and just urban growth. Thank you.
Sophie, thank you very much for sharing your research and making it digestible for those of us in the audience who don't have the same scientific background. One of the things that I would point out that is really interesting and powerful about your work is the methodology and is the idea of being able to take data from a range of sources, including data that you collected, but also census data, and then to be able to map that out in different layers. And that's a really, fantastic contribution to our ability to understand these impacts and the equity of transportation impacts. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Shaba Taskin. And Shaba, you can start to load your slides if you like. Shaba is a graduate student in the Master of Urban Innovation program at the Institute for Management and Innovation. And Taskin's research interests include social justice, inclusive urban spaces, and sustainable cities. And unlike the rest of our presenters today, Taskin was awarded the first Mobility Network Summer Internship Award that helped to support her required summer internship as part of the Professional Master of Urban Innovation. And it was co-funded by MyTax and also by her internship employer, Point A. And Shaba is supervised by Professor David Wolf and also co-supervised by me. Thank you, Shaba. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shauna, for the introduction. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Shaba. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a second-year graduate student at the Master of Urban Innovation program at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Just before I start, I would like to thank Professor Shauna Brail and Professor David Wolf for being my academic supervisors during this entire project. I'd also like to thank Zhou, who's not here at the presentation today, but she has been a great support for me. She's from the host, the director of the host organization, and she was an incredible support throughout the project. So the Mobility Summer Internship Award, in collaboration with MyTax and Point A, funded my internship at a transport demand management organization called Point A. Point A works to provide sustainable transportation solutions with focus on reducing congestion in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. The project that I worked on was creating a workplace hybridity assessment, a service that Pointe can now provide to workplaces all over Canada to figure out a remote work structure that is best suited for the employee, their team, and so today I'll take you through my findings of it. The challenge that we were facing with was that workplaces all over Canada are returning to work in person, actually all over the world, but we're focusing on Canada. So they're returning to work after working for a very long time online, and the transport demand management organization that I was working with, they required a way to offer their sustainable transportation solutions to people who are newly commuting to work now, again. But when they were having these conversations, they found out that workplaces are grappling with an even bigger solution at this point. Workplaces, especially large workplaces with about 250 plus employees, were having trouble figuring out who's coming back to work, when they're coming back, on which days, and they're having trouble figuring out a hybrid work structure that is suited for everyone. And as a result, the workplaces are facing issues with employee retention. So when they figured out that there is a need for a service that can help large workplaces determine work structures that is convenient for all, and that would include the HRs, the managers, the employees, and their expectations around hybrid work. So the solution that I was brought into work on was, it's twofold. First, it's a workplace hybridity assessment that would calculate the requirements and expectations around remote work for managers, employees who are currently working remotely and returning to work in person, as well as for new employees. And the second part of the solution is a report with the results of the hybridity assessment. So that would be a percentage that says how many hours a week an employee should be working remotely for a particular job role, and thereby gives you the in-person hours as well, and thereby the hybrid structure. It would also include best practices for hybrid work, and it would also provide the services Pointe gives, which are sustainable transportation solutions. So the key outcomes of this project were 3 assessments. The first is not really an assessment. It's an assessment, but it can be a questionnaire that can be done over the phone. It is a discussion with the HR manager of any workplace to determine what are their service requirements, what are their expectations from their service, and is the place ready for remote work. And the questions that would be asked in this first assessment would be used to customize the second and the third assessment, which would give the hybridity percentage. The second assessment is for the manager. So a manager would have certain expectations of what the employee, how many hours an employee should be working in person, and how many hours they should be working remotely. So we can calculate, we can take in the manager's expectations of the job role and what they expect of the employee. And the third assessment is for the employees themselves. This is to calculate the remote work possibility of their own job role and their own expectations of hybrid work structure. It also includes questions like if they're having commuting issues, how far they commute, and questions related to commute, because that might be a reason why someone might not be wanting to come in person or might be having difficulty commuting. So that's where the commuting part comes in. And so these are the 3 assessments. They are very short and can be done in 5 to 15 minutes, because the whole idea was that it needs to become easier to be able to communicate these questions between, for us to make it easier for employees, managers, HRs to communicate these questions and figure out something that's suited for all of them. And they really don't have time to be doing like a 5-day assessment. So the whole idea was to make it easier. So 5 to 15 minutes of very short assessments. And then based on the conversations we have, based on the assessments we do, there is a report that comes out at the end with the hybridity score, with the recommendations for best practices for hybrid work, and then the services that are offered by the organization. Some of the opportunities that were interesting that we're looking for is that there is an increasing interest in workplaces to improve the quality of life of employees. This is a trend that is going on now, especially after post-COVID. People are more interested in workplaces that offer better quality of life. And that is why their workplaces are facing issues with employee retention. Employees are facing issues regarding commute to workplace due to this renewed interest in in-person work. And this is an amazing opportunity to re-engage workplaces in sustainable transportation solutions, like subsidizing bike share, promoting carpooling, shuttle services, and so on. Some of the implications for policy and some of the questions that need to be asked now are how to maintain public health safety now that workplaces are returning to in-person work. In the area of Toronto, in the city of Toronto, there are 1.4 million people that are currently working. So this is 1.4 million people who are probably returning to in-person work or grappling with these questions or about remote work. And how do we engage workplaces to prioritize quality of life of employees? So another question that would be very important in terms of mobility is, how will this impact congestion in the GTHA area? And maybe remote work is a solution for that. But then again, this is the issue with research, right? There are so many pros and cons of the same thing. And how do we promote transportation that is sustainable when research shows that there's an increase in carbon footprint per person during remote work? So this is based on technology they're using, the dependency on technology, because people are traveling more to remote, far locations using transportation. So there is an issue of sustainable transportation also. How do we promote that? And so that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Shaba. That was a very insightful presentation. I was pleased that at the end, in the implications, you included the fact that it's actually unclear whether remote work conserves or expends more energy and emissions. And there is a lot of evidence to show that it actually increases commuting, increases carbon footprint, because maybe commutes are longer, or maybe there are more trips throughout the day when you're not working in a sort of concentrated area. Also really touch nicely on some of the huge challenges that offices are facing in terms of bringing people back, all for good reasons, but then the employee uprising in the sense of the desire and demand and opportunity to say, we deserve a quality of life and a satisfaction with employment that actually allows us this additional flexibility. And so I think this is a big challenge going forward, and a big challenge in terms of thinking about the future of mobility, both in the short term and the long term as well. So thank you very much. Our next and last presenter is Hanlin Zhou, who is a second-year PhD student in human geography. And Hanlin, if you want, you can load up your slides now. He's a second-year PhD student in human geography in the Department of Geography, Geomatics, and Environment. Hanlin Zhou's research interest is in linking GIS, RS, and CS techniques or data to human activities such as health behavior, crime problems, and economic issues. And Zhou's research project for the Mobility Network focuses on quantifying the walkability of the micro-built environment measured by street view imagery at a citywide scale. And Hanlin is supervised by Professor Zhou Wang. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shauna, and thanks to Mobility Network staff for organizing this event. I hope everyone can see the PowerPoint now. So today, my topic is the walkability assessment using the street view images, a case study at Toronto. So first, urban mobility plays a very important role in sustainable development of the cities. So regarding the mobility, the walkability is important measures of the microbuilt environment support for pedestrians to encourage walking. So for example, a good walkability design can benefit health behaviors, such as the physical activity levels. And the outdoors walkability and subsequent health outcomes can be affected by the built environment. So for instance, the presence of sidewalks and perceived safety can be part of the walkability measures, and thus it can also affect the people's physical activities levels. Therefore, understanding the relationships between the built environment and walkability can contribute to the public health. So here I try to introduce the street view images to assess the built environment related to the walkability. So first, the street view images compared to the remote sensing images captured by the satellite. These street view images capture the eye-level landscape with less code to assess. So nowadays, the street view images is available in several cities in nearly 200 countries. And also, the state-of-the-art scene understanding algorithms can enable researchers to quickly derive the elements from the street view images. So for example, we can derive the greenness, sidewalks, and roads from the street view images and use this to study the walkability. So here is my my result of the street view device landscape related to the walkability. I have collected over 400,000 images and extract the landscape from these images. So three elements are discussed here. So first, that is the green density, because the green is one of the important therapeutic landscapes related to the walkability. And as shown in the map on the left, so this green density map include both the street view device vegetation as well as the street view device terrain. So we can see that in the downtown areas, there is the low values of the green density. So which means that on the among the landscapes on the streets in that area, the percentage of the green density is relatively low. And the next map is the right top one. So here is the street view device sidewalk. So the darker color here means higher percentage of sidewalk. And we can see that the downtown areas have the relatively high values of the sidewalk. And while the other areas has relatively lower percentage of the sidewalk among the landscapes on those streets there. And for the roads, actually there is not a big difference. But we can see that some major highways, they have the relatively higher values of the roads. So which means that these areas have more roads for the vehicles. And also we can see some areas have less roads there. So there's a relatively low value in that areas. And overall, we can see that the objective measures by using the street view device elements related to the walkability. But how about the perception? So in the next part is the ongoing, I want to use an ongoing project that is to build a perception website for the perceived safety. So first, I already make a website which will be hosted on the on-campus servers to distribute the questions for the online volunteers. So when the online volunteers open the website, they can see the periods of images given some questions. So for example, the question can be, which images look favored to work? So which images makes you have more preference to work? So based on these questions, the volunteers can choose left, equal, or right to answer it. And the volunteers will be given a few questions, and he or she will need to assess some images. And after that, I will convert these peer-wise comparison results and convert it to the walkability scores following previous studies. And at the same time, I will use the approach that I mentioned in the previous slide, that is to conduct the image segmentations by state-of-the-art computer science techniques. So based on that case, I can use the segment elements as the predictors and use the walkability scores as the outcomes to train the machine learning models, such as the support vector machine models for perceived walkability predictions. And after that, I can map the human perceived walkabilities by different genders and racial identity groups. And however, this step still need to the ethics reviews because it is a human-related project. Therefore, so far, I'm still waiting for the ethics review board approvals. And once the approval is finished and passed, and I will distribute the website for the volunteers in the GTAs to rate the images online. And I have already contacted companies, and with the support of the Mobility Network funding, I can finally get enough response for the model training. And that's the end of my presentation, and thanks for your listening.
Hanlin, thank you very much. Among others, I appreciate that your presentation ends, but your research is ongoing. That is a fact of conducting research, right? And we all know that the ethics review is both important and can be time consuming, but actually makes the research better in the end. And so that's a fact of life in research, but that it sounds like you've set up a research sort of program, an agenda that once again combines this kind of looking at the physical landscape with some of the sort of social experience, and also with machine learning and AI. So really fascinating. I know I speak for many of us when I say we're looking forward to following the outcomes of your research as you're able to continue to engage.
Thank you.
I think all of our presenters, really emphasize the fact that, and I think this was probably one of the first sentences of our original proposal, that mobility touches on all elements of urban life. And in so many different ways, we heard this over and over again in the last hour. I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Lorena Losada Rojas, who joined the Mobility Network in July 2022 as a postdoctoral fellow to research and report on potential impacts of zero occupant vehicles operating within the City of Toronto in support of the City of Toronto's Automated Vehicles Technical Plan and the upcoming micro-mobility strategy. So welcome, Lisa. Lisa's research interests include transportation planning, accessibility, active travel, emerging mobility, public health, rural transportation, and sustainability. And she is now going to lead us in a Q&A. So I believe she may have a few of her own questions. And in addition, if others are participating and have questions of the researchers, please feel free to add them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shauna. So waiting for some of the questions to come on the chat, hopefully. I had my own question. But first I want to congratulate you all on getting here and presenting so many interesting research that, to be honest, I have never seen some of these topics before, coming from a more engineering background. But always the work of planners really excites me and make me think that as an engineers, we need to be doing more to be at the same mindset as you guys. But my first question, and I will try to go in order of the presentation, is for Haifa. So for me, it was very interesting that you were able to map the different routes of your participants. But I was wondering if there were concurrent points or similar points among the participants that you have, and which ones were those, and what ideas potentially you have about making those places more accessible and easier to reach.
Thanks for your question. Well, the thing is, the work that I did was not in one single neighborhood. So depending on the neighborhood I worked at, there were some hotspots that appeared in the maps of the different participants. The Square One area was a hotspot for almost half the participants. The Square One Mall, there are a couple of movie theaters in the local neighborhoods that some of the participants visited, as well as some religious nodes. Most of the participants practiced the Muslim faith, and so the research was taking place around right after Ramadan and between the two major celebration, the two Eids, basically. And so there were very frequent trips to the mosque, not just for religious practices, but also for community building and sport gaming. I hope this addresses the question.
Yeah, that's great. My second question is for Emily, and I think your work is very interesting, and I like that it has a background in your own experiences by living close to the area. But I was wondering if through doing your literature review, did you see any other places, either here in Canada or probably in the States, that have faced similar displacement problems? And at the long term, how has this resolved and potentially maybe pay off from the investments of transit, like against the displacement of people? Like, what was the experience like in other places?
Sorry, could you just repeat the second question? It was sort of muffled.
So my question was like, if through the literature, if you saw similar cases as the one that you have been studying, and at the long term, how those cases have rolled out, like play out. If it was positive to bring transit, or it was negative, or in which senses those were negative or positive.
Okay, thanks. I looked mostly at other Canadian cities, and overall, it seems to be a negative experience for existing tenants of these areas. In every case, the transit investment is accompanied by a transit-oriented development upzoning plan. Metrolinx, as the provincial public transit agency in Ontario, has several projects underway in Kitchener, Hamilton, Eglinton, and Finch in Toronto, Mississauga. As well, there are multiple projects in Ottawa. In every case, there are examples of tenants speaking out about displacement pressure. I think Hamilton is maybe a unique case in that the route chosen passes through a very dense old neighborhood, and so it requires the demolition of many buildings where there are existing residents. But I think in every case, the wider effects of transit-induced gentrification are seen as developers and investor landlords try to exploit that rent gap between the existing prices and what could be charged. I think there are stronger policies in the British Columbia context in terms of rental unit replacement in cases of demolition and tenant assistance that we should try to emulate in Ontario.
Okay, that's great. We do have some incoming questions in the chat, so I'll try to go over some of them. But let me first go to Sophie, because I noticed there is a question for her in the chat. I noticed that from the results of the regressions, you were, or we could show in the map where the hotspots for, let's say, major emissions were. But I was wondering if you also took into account or probably give it more thought to the places where lower emissions were, and what might be driving that lower emission. Is it the existence of canopy or more greenery around those areas, and what can we learn from those to potentially implement in those that are suffering?
Yeah, that was a great question. Yeah, it's something that we noticed, and I briefly mentioned. It was a bit hard with the slide cap to show the full picture, but essentially what we saw is that there are these hotspots. There's a big highway that essentially runs near the top across Toronto. And of course, as we would imagine, there were high emissions there. And then away from there is when they start to disperse to those background levels. And as I briefly mentioned, in those residential areas, so we saw in this like middle strip of Etobicoke-York, that was where we saw those low emissions. That's also where we saw the greatest proportion of parks and urban vegetation. And vegetation has this protective effect against air pollution, where, for example, leaves can absorb the pollutants or gaseous pollutions via the leaf stoma. So that's one of the main contributors there. We also saw a strip of low emissions bordering Lake Ontario, and it's a similar effect. The wind coming in from the lake helps disperse those air pollutants to those lower levels. So it was a mix of distance from major highways, distance from the airport, in that more like central part of Etobicoke, in addition to the greater amounts of vegetation that we saw. So that could translate to, for example, in those more high risk areas, adding more urban vegetation as a protective barrier. I know there are parts of Toronto, at least, that have walls where there's residential areas near a highway, but to add that second layer of, for example, like vines or trees by those walls would be a protective factor we could use, rerouting upcoming transportation projects away from high residential areas. Those are all things we learned from this project that I think could be translated to then protecting more people.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Now for Shaba, I think I also wanted to ask the question that is in the chat. What are some possible solutions that some companies have opted for their back to work hybrid arrangement? But before you answer that, I also wanted to know if there is something done before, like any kind of similar assessment to the one that you developed, and in which cases it's used, because this is like one of those first things that I hear in my life, and I'm very interested to know from where did you get the idea to conduct this.
So thank you for the questions first, and thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Muhammad, for the questions. So workplaces have been using assessments of. There are several assessments that you'd find on the internet that says, okay, this is a workplace quality of life assessment or remote work assessment, but I have not found something very similar to what I have made, because first, some of the assessments are very long, and that would take a very long time. And the most important factor of the assessments that I found elsewhere was that it is a do-it-yourself kind of a thing that organizations have with themselves, and they just give it out to employees and managers, and then for them to figure out what comes next. So how this service differs is that it is not just the assessment. We give a report at the end of the assessment that has the assessment score. So basically we're figuring out how many hours you should be working online and all of that. And then we give you a percentage for a particular job role. How that is useful is that you can use it for the current employees, like I said, but also for new employees, for job postings. I mean, whenever you go for job postings, you would see that they say this work is hybrid, but what that means is 4 days in person and 1 day online. And, you know, that's not working out. Or they say you'll be working 2 days and then they change once you have joined. These are some of the issues that employees are facing right now. So this is a way to do sort of, it's not a certification, but it is an external agency that will come in, do the assessment and the calculation for you, will do the conversations, because workplaces are not having these conversations. And that this really ties into the next question, which is like, what are some solutions workplaces are taking? The issue is that there is no one solid hybrid policy that is a best case scenario. And there is an issue because people are not having conversations. For example, employees have caregiving requirements now. I mean, even pets, you have pets at home, you don't want to go to work in person, and there are issues that you need to attend, and workplaces are not having these conversations, is what we found. I mean, I couldn't find solutions because they're just saying, okay, we are coming back to work in person. We have a policy that says you have to work 5 hours, you have to work certain hours, and this is it. But it is not based on conversations. It is not based on assessments of what the employee actually needs. And we feel that that is the biggest gap in the market right now, that it was an expectation that came out of COVID, that now COVID is sort of, it's still there, but like sort of it's better. So now we have everyone just come back in person. That's it. So I feel like we feel there is a gap in the solutions actually. Does that answer?
Yeah, that's great. And then for Hanlin, I was wondering if you are hoping to compare the results that you will get from the imagery, from other potential measures of walkability that are out there. My thought could be like, for example, comparing the green of the imagery against like land use data. Are you thinking to do that as part of your research, and how?
Do you mind repeat the last question again? The last sentence, the network is a little bit unstable.
So my question is, if you are planning to compare the results that you will get from assessing all this imagery with something that is already out there, for example, land use existing measures in Canada. One thing that I can think of is, for example, comparing the green with land uses that are more green in those areas to kind of see the validity of what you are processing compared to what is out there already.
So first, thanks for your questions. Yeah, I agree that there's a lot of sources that we can obtain the green measures, and for here, I think I try to present the street view images as one of the measures to measure the microbuilt environments in the urban areas. But so if I want to, since my work is more related to the physical activity related walkability, so I think it doesn't matter that which data source that I choose to measure. But if I want to just focus on the green space studies, I think it is a good way to combine both different data sources, such as from land use, from street view images, to make a comparison and to see what is the difference and the advantage of each type of the source to measure the green space. Yeah.
Okay. Then I don't see more questions coming in the chat, but I wanted to also ask specifically to Haifa and Emily, since you two are the ones that are having more of qualitative research from all the five. What are those potential future research projects that you would like to take on now that you finished the one that you have been working, either if it's related to what you have been working on or say?
Should I go first? Well, that's the thing with qualitative data, is that the deeper you dive, the richer the findings are, right? And through the analysis of the findings of the data, I followed what's labeled as reflexive thematic analysis. And so even in the process of writing these pieces, the different papers for journal articles, I find myself going back and thinking through some of these themes that were created. So I anticipate working on that for the next year at least, even post finishing my PhD. And then it's probably, I look forward to more small scale studies that actually look at marginalized experiences and experimenting more with methodologies that engage participants. Yeah.
Thanks for your question. Specifically, yeah, I am still in touch with many of the people that I got to know through tenant organizing around these evictions and demolitions, and trying with a group of other organizers to support people, and hopefully in future hold Metrolinx to account. I don't think the fight is over. And also working with a coalition of affordable housing developers in Hamilton called Hamilton is Home that are launching a campaign to demand that the land acquired by Metrolinx be donated to affordable housing developers. So I'm supporting that through some, practical research and accounting of, the land available and what could be built. And as well connecting with tenant organizers in other cities where Metrolinx has projects underway or proposed to try to connect tenants and share strategy.
Okay. I think we are on time to close up the Q&A. I will turn it over to you, Dr.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa, for expertly managing and asking all of those questions. I'd like to now introduce Kevin Chan, who has joined us. He is the Vice Chair of the University of Toronto Transportation Alumni Network. He graduated from U of T in 2016 with a Master of Science in Planning. And Kevin would like to share, I think, an invitation and some information about the Transportation Alumni Network. So it's all yours, Kevin.
Great, thanks so much, Dr. Brail. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Thanks so much for having me. As mentioned, my name is Kevin Chan, and just have a quick presentation to let you know about the University of Toronto Transportation Alumni Association. We're an association for alumni from across the university. So anyone who studied in any program and then has decided to work in the field of transportation is welcome to join. So there's people from, of course, planning and engineering, but also all sorts of disciplines. So it's a very kind of multidisciplinary organization. We also have a couple of marquee events which may be of interest. Prior to COVID, of course, we had an annual mixer which attracted alumni and a lot of students to come out and kind of connect with other professionals working in the field. We're hoping to bring that back this year. It's obviously been on hiatus for a couple of years, but there's an opportunity to get involved there. And then the other event that you might be interested in, actually our symposium was yesterday. So it would probably be next year for all of you. But we host an annual student competition around a theme. The theme changes every year. This year's, for example, was related to sort of transportation, climate resiliency type research projects. So students competed for prizes and undertook research. We pair students and former alumni together to kind of provide mentorship to their research projects. So if that's something of interest, it will be coming up probably next June for the 5th annual version. Finally, if you want to get more information, we're open. We have a few student reps on the committee, so there's opportunities for students to get involved, both with our committee and also generally with the events we're putting on. So you can follow us on LinkedIn. Facebook. We also have a mailing list. There's not too many emails, probably maybe 3 or 4 a year, letting people know about events and things that are coming up. And I think Pat is planning to put the links for all of these in the chat. So if you're interested, take a look. But thanks so much for the opportunity to share about our network.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. It's terrific. The Mobility Network never actually ends, because when you graduate from U of T and you're part of the Mobility Network, you can move straight on to the University of Toronto Transportation Alumni Network and continue to participate and engage. We're going to close, and before we do that, and before we say thank you, I would like to announce that we are launching the call for research proposals for the 2022-2023 Graduate Student Research Award. It's open as of today. And if you enjoyed this session, if you appreciated and benefited from the funding that you received, please share this information with your friends. I believe the link will be in the chat and we will begin to share it by email and social media and through our networks tomorrow. The deadline for applications is Thursday, October 20th at 4 p.m. And once again, we will be supporting up to 4 graduate students who are conducting research on any element of mobility from any discipline, who are supervised by a UTM-based faculty member. We have a number who are included on our call for applications that are members of the Mobility Network, but the Mobility Network is inclusive, and we welcome additional members. And so if someone has a supervisor in mind that's not already part of the network, we would be pleased to welcome them in. So I want to say thank you again to all of our presenters today, to Haifa, Emily, Shaba, Sophie, and Hanlin. Your research and your presentations were excellent. You raised the profile not just of mobility, but of mobility as an incredibly interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and dynamic field of study. And as I said before, something that touches all elements of urban life. I also want to thank Dr. Losada Rojas for very expertly moderating our question and answer period, and also welcome to the Mobility Network. I want to thank the UTM Vice President Research Office for generously funding these initiatives that we're running through the Mobility Network. I want to thank the Institute for Management and Innovation for helping provide resources and website space and some graphics. And finally, and also very importantly, the Mobility Network and its staff, especially Pat Doherty, who is the mastermind behind this event and who kept us all both on time and on focus. So thank you very, very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Thank you.